The microphone was still warm from her hand when she said it. I was standing in my wedding dress in front of 240 guests, in front of my new husband, in front of his entire extended family. And his mother had just taken the microphone from the best man's hand without asking, looked directly at me, and said in a voice loud enough to reach the back tables that I wasn't even a real Calder, that I was adopted, that I had no real family, no real blood, no real right to stand there in white and call myself part of anything. The room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine, his whole body going rigid beside me. I felt 240 pairs of eyes shift, all at once, toward me. Some confused, some curious, a few already smirking, already reaching for their phones under the tables. But I want you to know something before I tell you what happened in the next 4 minutes. My grandmother, my mother's mother, 81 years old, sharp as a blade even now, was sitting at the front table, and in her purse, folded in an envelope she had been carrying for 11 days, was something that was about to turn my mother-in-law's victory into the single worst mistake of her entire life. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now where you are. I read every comment, and knowing how far this story has traveled means more to me than you probably realize. Now, let me take you back, because to understand what happened on that stage, what my grandmother did, what the room saw, what it cost my mother-in-law in the end, you need to understand exactly who Eleanor Calder was and exactly how long she had been planning this moment. I want to be upfront with you before we go any further. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. The names, the people, the events, all of it is imagined. Any resemblance to anyone real is entirely coincidental. My name is Margaret Hale. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 29 years old, and 3 months ago, I married a man named Daniel Calder in a small historic chapel in Savannah, Georgia. Surrounded by white magnolias and string lights, and exactly the kind of wedding I had dreamed about since I was a little girl sketching dresses in the margins of my school notebooks. I should tell you up front. Yes, I was adopted. I'm not going to pretend that detail away, because it's true, and because the way my mother-in-law used it that night says everything about who she is, and nothing at all about who I am. I was adopted at 6 weeks old by Robert and Carol Hale, a kind, unremarkable couple from a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina. My biological mother had been 19, unmarried, and entirely unsupported by her own family at the time. She made the hardest decision a person can make, and she made it, from everything I was ever told, out of love rather than abandonment. My parents. My real parents, the ones who raised me, the ones who sat up with me through chicken pox and broken hearts and 3 a.m. study sessions before the SAT. Never once let me feel like a footnote in my own story. But there was one more person in my life who mattered more than almost anyone else. My grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor wasn't biologically related to me either. Not by blood, but by every measure that actually counts. She was my grandmother in the truest sense of the word. She had been my mother Carol's mother. Sharp-tongued, fiercely intelligent. The kind of woman who had run a small accounting firm out of her dining room for 30 years and never once let a man talk over her in a meeting. Eleanor had been there the day my parents brought me home. She told me once, years later, that she held me in the hospital parking lot before we even got in the car, and she looked down at my face and said out loud, to no one, "This one is going to need somebody fierce on her side. I suppose that's going to be me." She wasn't wrong. Growing up, I never felt like the adopted kid. I felt like Maggie Hale, full stop. My parents were warm, steady people who ran a small hardware store in town, and Eleanor was the family member who showed up to everything. Every recital, every soccer game, every awkward middle school graduation. Sitting in the front row with her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair, clapping louder than anyone else in the building. When I was 14,
My biological mother reached out through the adoption agency, asking if I might want to contact her someday. My parents handled it with extraordinary grace. They didn't panic. They didn't get defensive. They simply told me the truth, gave me the choice, and let me decide. I decided at 14 that I wasn't ready. I decided at 22 that I was. Her name was Jennifer. We exchanged letters for almost a year before we ever met in person, and when we finally did meet, at a quiet coffee shop in Charleston, both of us nervous, both of us crying within the first 10 minutes. It wasn't the reunion you see in movies. It was quieter than that, sadder in some ways. Jennifer had built a life of her own by then, a husband, two younger children, and a job she liked. We weren't going to become mother and daughter in any traditional sense, but we became something friendly, connected, honest. And here is the detail that matters most for everything that happens later in this story. Jennifer kept records, meticulous records. Every letter the adoption agency had ever sent her, every piece of correspondence. A signed, notarized statement she had given the agency at the time of the adoption, explaining her decision in her own words, dated and filed. She had kept all of it in a fireproof lockbox for 29 years, the way some people keep their grandmother's wedding ring. When I told Eleanor about reconnecting with Jennifer, my grandmother didn't ask a single question about feelings or emotions. She asked, in typical Eleanor fashion, does she still have the original paperwork? The notarized statement? Get copies. Always get copies, Maggie. You never know when you'll need to prove exactly what happened and exactly why. I thought at the time that she was just being practical. Eleanor was always practical. I had no idea she was about to become prophetic. I met Daniel Calder 2 years ago at a charity gala in downtown Savannah. I was working as an interior designer by then, building a small but growing client list, and Daniel was there representing his family's commercial real estate firm. The Calder Group, a name that meant something in certain Savannah social circles, the kind of old money local prominence that gets your photograph in the society pages of the local paper twice a year. Daniel himself was nothing like what I expected from that world. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who actually listened when you talked instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He asked me about my work with genuine curiosity. He remembered small details from our first conversation weeks later. When I eventually told him about being adopted, early, deliberately, because I have never wanted to build anything on a foundation where that information felt like a hidden landmine, he simply nodded and said, okay, and you're still you. That doesn't change anything about how I feel. I fell in love with him slowly and then all at once, the way people describe it in books that I had always privately suspected were exaggerating. His mother was a different story from the very beginning. Patricia Calder was the kind of woman who had built her entire identity around the Calder name. 3 generations of Savannah real estate money. A family crest that genuinely existed and that she genuinely referenced in conversation. A social calendar built almost entirely around maintaining and displaying status. She was polished, immaculately put together, never raised her voice in public, and possessed one of the coldest, most calculating gazes I had ever encountered in another human being. The first time Daniel brought me to a family dinner, Patricia looked me over for exactly 3 seconds before she asked, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and where does your family come from, dear? The Hales. I'm not familiar with that name in Savannah society. I told her simply that my parents ran a hardware store outside Charleston. Her smile thinned by perhaps a single degree, but she said nothing further that night. I would come to understand, over the following months, that Patricia Calder rarely said anything directly. She communicated through implication, through carefully placed comments, through the kind of social warfare that leaves no fingerprints. The engagement happened 8 months ago on a Tuesday evening, with no fanfare, no audience. Just Daniel down on one knee in the small garden behind his apartment, lit by string lights he had clearly spent an embarrassing amount of time hanging himself. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Patricia's reaction when Daniel called to tell her was, according to Daniel, who relayed it to me with visible discomfort. A long pause followed by, well, I suppose we'll have to see how the wedding planning goes before we know how this family feels about things. It was a threat disguised as a sentence. I understood that even then. Daniel understood it too, and to his credit, he confronted his mother directly about it that same week, telling her plainly that Margaret was going to be his wife regardless of how the wedding planning unfolded, and that her approval, while wanted, was not actually required. Patricia backed off the topic publicly after that conversation. She did not, however, stop working privately. Over the following months, small things began happening that I couldn't quite name as malicious in isolation, but that formed a clear pattern when I stepped back and looked at them together. Patricia accidentally left me off the guest list for a Calder family Easter gathering, then apologized profusely when Daniel noticed, claiming it was simply an oversight by her assistant. She would mention in casual conversation at family events how lovely it was that her late husband's family had such deep, traceable roots in Savannah, always glancing my way at exactly the moment she said the word traceable, as if testing whether I would react. She invited Daniel to a series of lunches without me, framing them as mother son time, during which Daniel told me later, looking genuinely troubled, she would casually ask questions designed to plant doubt. Don't you wonder about her background, sweetheart? Don't you think it's worth knowing more about where she actually comes from, biologically? Blood matters more than people like to admit, Daniel. It always shows eventually. Daniel, to his enormous credit, shut these conversations down every single time, often more bluntly with each repetition. But Patricia was a patient woman. She had built a real estate empire on patience and timing. She was not going to be deterred by one disappointing conversation, or 5 or 15. She was simply waiting for an audience large enough to matter. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had dinner with my grandmother, Eleanor, at her favorite restaurant downtown, the same corner booth she had been requesting for over a decade. I told her, somewhat reluctantly, about the pattern of comments from Patricia, the traceable roots remark. The blood matters more than people like to admit, relayed secondhand through Daniel. Eleanor listened without interrupting, the way she always did, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly with each new detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the white tablecloth. Then she asked me a question that, at the time, felt almost beside the point. Maggie, do you still have Jennifer's contact information? The original biological mother. I told her yes, of course, we stayed in touch. And does Jennifer still have that lockbox? The notarized statement, the agency paperwork, everything she kept. I told her I believed so. I hadn't asked recently, but Jennifer wasn't the type to throw anything like that away. Eleanor nodded slowly, the way she used to nod over a column of numbers that wasn't quite balancing yet, but was about to. I want you to do something for me, she said. I want you to call Jennifer this week. I want you to ask her, very gently, if she would be willing to come to your wedding. Quietly, in the background, not as a spectacle, just present. And I want you to ask her if she still has every single piece of that original paperwork, and if she'd be willing to bring copies. I asked her why, somewhat baffled by the specificity of the request. Eleanor looked at me with an expression I had seen exactly twice before in my life. Once when she discovered an employee at her old firm had been quietly skimming from client accounts for years, and once when a contractor tried to overcharge my parents for hardware store renovations and Eleanor personally drove down, sat across from him, and recited his own invoice back to him line by line until he apologized and refunded the difference. Because, Margaret, she said, using my full name, which she only did when she wanted me to take something seriously, that woman is going to do something at your wedding. I don't know exactly what, and I don't know exactly when, but women like Patricia Calder do not spend 8 months quietly building a case against a person unless they intend eventually to present it. And when she does, sweetheart, I would very much like to be holding the actual paperwork while she's holding nothing but assumptions. I drove home that night feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I had no idea, sitting in that car, just how precisely correct my grandmother was about to be. The wedding itself, for the first 90 minutes, was everything I had ever dreamed it could be. The ceremony took place in a small historic chapel just outside downtown Savannah, with white walls and tall, arched windows, the late afternoon light pouring gold across the pews. Daniel cried during his vows, which surprised exactly no one who knew him. I cried watching him cry, which surprised exactly no one who knew me. The reception was held afterward in a restored carriage house on the same property. String lights crossing the exposed wooden beams overhead, round tables draped in soft ivory linen, 240 guests eating, drinking, dancing, laughing. My parents sat at the family table, beaming the way they had beamed at every major milestone of my entire life. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat directly beside them, sharp and composed in a deep emerald dress, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that she had had set that morning specifically for the occasion. And quietly, at a smaller table near the back, dressed elegantly but unobtrusively, sat Jennifer, my biological mother, along with a thin manila folder resting in her lap that she had not yet opened. Patricia Calder did not know Jennifer was in the room. Patricia Calder did not know about the folder. Patricia Calder, in fact, believed she was about to deliver the single most devastating moment of social theater Savannah society had witnessed in years, and that she was about to deliver it without a single witness capable of contradicting her. She had no idea she was about to be the only person in that carriage house who didn't understand what was actually happening. It happened during the toasts. The best man, Daniel's college roommate, had just finished a warm, slightly too long speech about loyalty and friendship, and was passing the microphone toward the maid of honor when Patricia rose from her seat at the head table, walked directly to the small stage at the front of the room, and took the microphone from the best man's hand before he had even fully released it. The room, sensing the mother of the groom was about to speak, settled into the kind of polite, expectant quiet that crowds offer automatically to anyone holding a microphone at a family event. Patricia smiled, the same polished, practiced smile she wore in every society page photograph, and began speaking about family legacy, about the Calder name, about roots and tradition, and what it means to truly belong to something larger than yourself. And then, without any visible change in her tone, without raising her voice even slightly, she said it. I think it's important on a day about family that we're honest about what family actually means. And I think it's important that everyone here understands something about my new daughter-in-law. Margaret was adopted as an infant. She doesn't actually know her real family, her real blood, her real history. She built her entire identity on people who simply took her in out of charity. I say this not to be unkind, but because I believe families deserve to know the truth about who they're truly welcoming into their bloodline. And the truth is, she's not really a Hale, and she'll certainly never really be a Calder. She's a stranger we've all very generously agreed to love. The silence that followed lasted, by my own internal count, somewhere close to 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is an extraordinarily long time when 240 people are staring directly at you. I felt every part of my body go cold and distant at once. The specific sensation of watching your own wedding day, the single happiest day you had planned for, get hijacked and weaponized in front of an entire room of witnesses. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine so hard it nearly hurt. I heard, somewhere behind me, the unmistakable small click of at least one phone camera shutter. I opened my mouth, though I genuinely don't know what I intended to say, because in that exact moment, before a single word left me, my grandmother Eleanor stood up. Eleanor did not rush. She did not raise her voice before she even had the microphone. She simply rose from her chair with the calm, unhurried precision of a woman who had spent 30 years walking into rooms full of people who underestimated her, and she walked slowly, deliberately toward the front of the room. Patricia, still holding the microphone, watched her approach with an expression of mild confusion that hadn't yet curdled into alarm. Eleanor reached the stage, extended her hand, and said with perfect icy politeness, "May I borrow that for just a moment, dear Patricia?" Perhaps out of pure social reflex, perhaps simply unable to think of a graceful way to refuse an 81-year-old woman in front of 240 witnesses, handed over the microphone. Eleanor turned to face the room. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying easily through the carriage house without any need to raise it. "I am Margaret's grandmother. Not by adoption paperwork, by something a great deal more durable than that. And I want to thank Patricia for bringing up the subject of family history tonight, because it turns out I came prepared to discuss exactly that." She reached into her small clutch purse and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. Margaret's biological mother, a woman named Jennifer, made the difficult, loving decision 29 years ago to place her daughter with a family who could give her a stable, devoted home. That decision was documented, notarized, and witnessed at the time. And Jennifer. Margaret's biological mother is actually here with us tonight, sitting quietly at table 14, because Margaret invited her, because Margaret has built a relationship with her own biological family out of love rather than shame, which is more than I can currently say for some of the people standing on the stage. A low murmur moved through the room. I watched, frozen, as every head turned toward table 14, where Jennifer rose slowly to her feet, the manila folder now open in her hands, her expression calm and unbothered. A woman who had clearly known this moment might come and had prepared herself accordingly. Eleanor wasn't finished, but since Patricia seemed so deeply concerned with bloodlines and traceable history tonight, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a new, sharper edge. I thought the room might be curious about a few other things. Things I happened to learn over the past several months. Because unlike some people, I don't simply gossip about a family. I research them. She unfolded the paper in her hand. This is a public property records filing from Chatham County dated 4 years ago, showing that the Calder Group's primary commercial holding, the building that funds, by my estimate, roughly 60% of this family's visible wealth, was transferred not through 3 generations of inherited family success, as has been repeatedly implied in numerous newspaper profiles, but through a foreclosure auction purchased for 11 cents on the dollar from a family who lost everything in the 2009 financial crisis. A family, incidentally, who still lives here in Savannah and who I happened to have a very illuminating conversation with 3 weeks ago. The murmur in the room shifted into something closer to stunned silence. I don't say this to embarrass anyone. Eleanor said, her tone almost gentle now, almost reasonable, which somehow made it land harder. I say it because Patricia stood on this stage on my granddaughter's wedding day and suggested that some bloodlines are more legitimate than others, that some histories are worth honoring and others worth erasing. I simply think if we're going to discuss family history and what people genuinely earned versus what they quietly acquired, we should be willing to discuss all of it, equally, in public, since that seems to be the standard Patricia has set for tonight. Patricia's face, by this point, had gone the color of old paper. Daniel stood up. He walked to the front of the room, took the microphone gently from his grandmother-in-law's hand, and turned to face his own mother directly, in front of every single guest who had come to watch him get married. Mom, he said, his voice tight, controlled, audibly furious, in the specific way of someone who has spent his entire life being controlled and has finally run out of patience for it. I want you to apologize to my wife, right now, in front of everyone you just humiliated her in front of. Patricia, visibly rattled for the first time in the entire evening, attempted to recover her composure. Daniel, I was simply being honest about. You were being cruel. Daniel cut in, on purpose, in front of 240 people, on the one day I asked you to just be decent for 3 hours. And now everyone in this room also knows exactly how the Calder Group actually built its fortune, which I'm guessing wasn't the legacy conversation you were hoping to have tonight. He turned to the room. I apologize to everyone for this. This isn't what today was supposed to be about. He looked back at his mother. Mom, you can apologize to Margaret right now in front of everyone, or you can leave. Those are genuinely the only 2 options I'm giving you. The room had gone fully, completely silent. 240 people, frozen mid-meal, watching a woman who had spent decades curating a flawless public image stand on a small wedding stage with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Patricia looked at her son. She looked at me. She looked very briefly at Eleanor, who simply held her gaze with the calm, unhurried patience of a woman who had already won and was waiting for everyone else in the room to catch up to that fact. Then Patricia set down the microphone, smoothed her dress with both hands, and walked out of the carriage house without saying a single additional word. She did not apologize that night. She did not apologize the following week either, despite 3 increasingly direct phone calls from Daniel, each one ending with Patricia hanging up before the conversation reached any kind of resolution. What happened instead over the following 2 months was something closer to a quiet social collapse than a single dramatic confrontation. The Chatham County property records Eleanor had referenced were, of course, entirely public and easily verifiable. Eleanor had simply done the work that no one in Savannah society had ever bothered to do, because no one had ever had a reason to question the polished version of the Calder family story. Once verified, once whispered between the right people at the right country club lunches, the story spread through Savannah's social circles with the particular efficiency that only genuinely juicy, verifiable scandal can achieve. The foreclosure detail itself wasn't even illegal or even particularly unusual. Plenty of fortunes get built on opportunistic real estate purchases during economic downturns, and Daniel told me later that his father, before he passed, had actually been fairly open about the foreclosure purchase within the family. It was simply never something Patricia mentioned publicly because it conflicted with the multi-generational legacy narrative she had spent 30 years carefully constructing for every society page profile and charity gala introduction. The damage wasn't the fact itself. The damage was the gap between the story Patricia had told everyone and the truth Eleanor had calmly, precisely laid out in front of 240 witnesses, on a night when Patricia herself had chosen to make bloodlines and inherited legitimacy the explicit topic of conversation. Several of Patricia's longtime social committees quietly removed her from leadership positions over the following weeks, citing vague scheduling conflicts that nobody believed. 2 charity boards declined to renew her membership for the next cycle. The local society pages, which had photographed her at 3 or 4 events a year for over a decade, simply stopped including her. Daniel, for his part, made a decision I respected enormously. He didn't cut his mother off entirely. He told me he wasn't interested in becoming someone who burns every bridge the moment it gets difficult. But he set and held a single firm boundary. Patricia would not be allowed any unsupervised time with our future children. Patricia would not be invited to family gatherings unless she had formally and directly apologized to me in person for what she said that night. And until that apology came, the relationship would exist at exactly the distance Patricia herself had chosen when she picked up that microphone. That apology took 4 months to arrive. When it finally did, a quiet, halting conversation over coffee, Patricia visibly smaller than I had ever seen her, the social armor finally cracked. I accepted it. Not because I had forgotten what she said, and not because I particularly trusted it wouldn't happen again in some other form. I accepted it because Eleanor had taught me, over a lifetime of dinners and lessons disguised as casual conversation, that real strength isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the truth gets said clearly once in front of the right witnesses, and then choosing deliberately what kind of person you want to be afterward. Jennifer and I are closer now than we've ever been. She tells people with a small private smile I've grown to love that she finally got to attend her daughter's wedding after 29 years of wondering what that day might have looked like, and that it turned out to be even more memorable than she could have possibly imagined. Eleanor still sits in the front row of every major event in my life, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, ready, as always, with whatever quiet research she's decided the situation requires. A few weeks ago, over dinner at her favorite corner booth, I asked her, half joking, how long she had actually been digging into the Calder family's property records before the wedding. She looked at me over the top of her water glass with the particular expression of a woman who has never once apologized for being thorough. Margaret, she said, I told you months ago. You never know when you'll need to prove exactly what happened and exactly why. I simply prefer to be prepared before I need to be, rather than after. I think about that conversation often now, about the folded paper in her purse, about the silent, unbothered way Jennifer rose to her feet at table 14, folder already open, ready. About the specific, particular satisfaction of watching someone who tried to use the truth as a weapon against you discover, in real time, in front of everyone, that you were the one actually holding it. If you were in my shoes, would you have forgiven Patricia after 4 months? Or would you have waited longer? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the Family Ledger for a brand new story every single day.